Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amour de Soi Wellness. And Donovon Jenson is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice. This is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are going to be talking about, is happiness internal or external? What are your thoughts, Donovan? Would you like to kick things off on this conversation? Internal or external, or maybe both?
Yeah, so I think, some of the first things that come to mind are, let's start with external, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about happiness being external, if you think about it for more than 1 second, you're going to realize it's kind of a little bit shallow of an idea, right? You have seen or heard about people who have pretty much everything they could ever want,
Mm-hmm.
and are still not happy to some degree. So we can kind of rule out external as at least the sole factor in producing happiness.
Totally.
But on the flip side, when you think about something like, let's say you live somewhere that has, no running water, and there's constant noise outside, and there's all sorts of violence and crime where you are, and there's a bunch of negative external things. Now, you're going to be able to moderate your happiness to a degree with using some internal strategies, right? The way you frame certain things, how you respond to certain things. Mm-hmm. But at a certain point, it's going to be much, much easier to be happy or optimize your happiness in an environment that is a little bit more conducive. So to me, sort of the first thing that comes to mind is it's got to be a mix of both. And I think probably internal weighs a little bit heavier, but before I just keep rambling on, I'll let you jump in and sort of share some of your initial thoughts.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, because what came to my mind is, definitely there's both internal and external factors, and we shouldn't just depend on our external factors to determine our sense of happiness, but it can definitely influence our ability to be happy. Like when you were talking about noisy environment, it just had me think about when I lived in San Francisco, and it was like super noise, like traffic, people screaming in the middle of the night, not the most relaxing environment, which not necessarily is bad. There was pros to living in San Francisco, easy to go out and check out places. It's walkable, like all sorts of things. But I remember just when I moved from San Francisco to Sacramento, it was so quiet at night. And initially it was a little disturbing because I was like, there's no noise, and it threw me off a little bit, but ultimately it was more enjoyable, and it produced better quality sleep in my mind. So that in my mind, having a good health and well-being promotes my happiness in a way, in that sense, as well as, I had better support structures and, family, and I was just in a better health routine overall. So I felt like I was able to better, and I wasn't eating out nearly as much when I was in San Francisco. So ultimately I felt like my well-being was much better, more in check when I was in Sacramento. And therefore that led to a higher degree of happiness, just because I was able to care for myself in a better manner than I was in San Francisco. So that's what my initial thought was when you were sharing.
Yeah. So what I heard was a lot of these like physical or well-being sort of factors. And that's definitely a huge piece of it. I think another big piece of it is going on to sort of internal side is sort of your mindset and the way you approach some of the things that you interact with. And I think the most extreme versions of the internal happiness part are sort of Buddhism or Stoicism, right? That weigh really heavily into sort of, hey, you can sort of make inner peace and calm by sort of changing your mindset around things and doing different exercises and whatnot. But one of the things that I think would be interesting is, like, at what point does the balance sort of tip, right? Like in general, a monk, right, who's practiced a ton of meditation is going to be very calm and relaxed and able to control their internal state. But at a certain point, if you push those external factors really, really far, like if you didn't let them sleep for forever or eat
True.
or
Be a
put them in a
crank.
noisy environment or put them, you combine all of those things together. So
Right.
to me, the way that the way that I look at it is sort of a range,
Mhm.
where it's like there are certain activities that you can do on the internal side that allow you to deal with more external problems.
Mhm.
But there's also actions you can take to sort of resolve some of the external things that are coming up. And I think there is a camp of people who are very much in this mindset of like, well, you just need to choose to be happy and focus on the right things and stay positive and whatever else, and sort of ignore to a degree some of the things that you can do in your external environment to really improve sort of the environment or the fertility for like creating happiness.
Right.
I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are around that.
Yeah. I just imagine a monk, if well, monks generally, I think, live in like sanctuary type of environments where it's peaceful and calm. So I think that induces their sense of peace and calm. But I was just thinking, I'm like, man, what if a monk was just living in the heart of San Francisco? Someone was like screaming. Like, I mean, I think they can maintain it better than the average person, probably because of their training and their experience. But I'd be curious, how well they would be. So I think, yeah, you can take yourself out of like a stressful environment, whether that's a living situation or maybe it's a work job situation, or maybe it's a relationship that's stressful for you, whatever that might be, to promote happiness. But at the same time, it's like sometimes you can't just quit your job or you can't just quit your family kind of a thing. So what I often tell a lot of my patients is like, you can learn, like, you can't change people, they're going to be people, and sometimes you can't just quit them like your family. So you can learn to regulate yourself and your own emotions and your own stress response, so whatever they do or say doesn't impact you as much, because they're going to just be them. But what you do on an internal level, how you develop yourself on a personal development state or regulating your nervous system, whatever that might be, can help you like not be bothered or sucked into having that tick away from your happiness, I guess. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's one of the best examples of how sort of this interplay of internal and external
Yeah.
works, right? Because you hear some people in relationships say things like, oh, this person makes me so mad, or all these other, sort of feelings and whatnot. And that piece, right? There's one piece is how you respond to and internalize, and how you let other people feel, and things like that. But
Mhm.
another piece is, on the external side, if you are just, let's say you get to a place where you can kind of accept most of that stuff without it bothering you, if you're not also taking the action to say like, hey, you're doing this thing and it's impacting me negatively, or hey, I would prefer if you do X instead of Y, or basically opening up the conversation to shape
Mhm.
sort of some of their behavior. And you can't 100% guarantee that they're going to do it, but if you only work on that internal half, then
Mhm.
you may end up in sort of like a toxic relationship where you're just accepting or okay with all of the negative things that are happening,
Right.
or just a relationship that's not ideal and negative things are happening and you just learn to manage them instead of learning to manage them and sort of working with the other person to find a better sort of baseline. So I think that's like the best, or one of the best examples for how you can't just do one or the other, right? Because the other path would be
Right.
full external and just saying you can never act like this. I'm gonna
Right.
freak out every single time. We're gonna fight every time,
Right.
and it's gonna be this huge problem no matter what. And maybe for some behaviors that is the correct course of action, but for the most part, if you go on that full external path and just try to force them to change, like you were saying, you can't necessarily control that. So you
Yeah.
also need the internal balance or awareness to go,
Mhm.
okay, and I guess it goes to like setting boundaries and things like that, where it's like, okay, I'm going to ask them to do this. If they don't, I'm going to act this way. And then having enough internal balance or resolve to sort of maintain that instead of getting sucked in and, oh, okay, you said this, now I'm mad and fight and expand and all that.
Yeah, no, you make a really good point that should definitely be factored in, and that, it shouldn't be all internal, and, like their bad behavior shouldn't necessarily be acceptable, but it's also a matter of you, as well as hopefully that other individual that might be, a source of stress or heartache or whatever that might be, to develop communication skills, because that would definitely improve the situation. But, you know, a person's willingness, sometimes it could be one-sided, sometimes it's both people who want to, sometimes it's neither people. So it just, that definitely makes the difference, and it can help improve the source of. But I do want to kind of like, I think that is a really important piece, but I also think it's important, like I've heard, I want to like what I want to distinguish is that, like, we are technically 100% responsible for our own happiness, and we're also 100% responsible for our own suffering, which is not the fun thing to think about for other people. But it doesn't mean, like, because it's like we can't just blame all other people for why we're not happy. We have to like take ownership of that. But, other people can, I don't know what the exact word I want to use is, like influence, not necessarily fully responsible for our happiness, but just like can influence the balance of happiness in some degree. But, we have to own up to, like, maybe we have to set that boundary if they're not respecting what it is that we need for ourselves and our emotional state. Or maybe it's being able to learn and develop yourself on an emotional way to be able to communicate with them more effectively. I think there's a lot of ways to explore that.
Yeah, so maybe we can argue a little bit, because I want to push back a little
Sure.
bit.
Yeah.
I would disagree
Okay.
that it's 100% that you're 100% in control of your happiness, right? Because here's an example,
Right.
is if my boss gives me a bonus today, right? I get a bonus.
Yeah, totally.
I'm going to feel happiness probably before I have a chance to even act on sort of my interpretation of the event, right? Before I'm able to go, oh, like I really enjoy this bonus and this is cool, and now I can buy this thing. Like I'm going to feel some amount of happiness before that even happens. But more to your point, and I think we're pretty well aligned. It's just like a minor semantic wording difference. But more to that point, whether or not I got a bonus or something like that would largely be dependent on a lot of actions that I had taken in the past, right? Like that's going to largely determine the sorts of things that end up happening. But that being said, I think it is extremely critical that you figure out which pieces of things that you are in control of and act on those, because the level of influence we have to determine a large number of events that influence our happiness is really, really high, right? Like you were saying, if my partner is doing something that I don't like, I have the ability to communicate with her. I have the ability to work on sort of my emotional reactions to things. I have the ability to try to find a third-party coach or a counselor to help us. I have the ability, right? There are a lot of options for things to sort of improve the environment that I'm in, or sort of the outcomes of certain things. I would just minor argue that it's 100% in control. But we do have an absolute massive amount of influence over the way that things go. All right, back to you.
Yeah. Well, I guess to elaborate on what more I meant, I kind of get where you're coming from, and it does make sense. But just like it's more about taking ownership and responsibility, like, and not putting blame onto other people for why you're miserable, is kind of like where I was going with that. But also the fact that, yes, you can control a lot of how your life goes, but there's also a lot about life that you can't control. And that's kind of how it goes. And if you're going to let those things that you can't control really upset you and, bring you down and ruin your happiness, that's kind of like on you, because you're just so sucked into the ideas like, well, my life sucks, my job sucks, my relationship sucks, like blah, 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 whatever, all of these things suck. And that's why I'm unhappy versus, and it's like, when you don't take responsibility, then you have like no power to do anything about that, versus like, oh, if you own your suffering as well as your happiness, then it gives you the power to do something about it. So yeah, I get where you're coming from. I guess this is where I wanted to like elaborate, because it could be a little confusing maybe.
Yeah, let me try a different angle and we'll see if
Okay.
we're aligned
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
So to me, it sounds like sort of what you're saying is when we take actions or have outcomes and we choose the interpretation where everything is completely out of our control. So, for
Right.
example, to say something like, I hate my job, this job sucks,
Mm-hmm.
without factoring in, you can get a different job. You can apply for other jobs. You can, start looking, or even to go backwards in time, you are the one who chose to take on the job. Maybe you didn't know what it was going to be or how it was going to be, but
Right.
sort of taking ownership over the actions that have gotten you there, as well as the ones that could potentially get you out of it. Because I think it's extremely common to see people say stuff like, oh, well, I hate this job, but I can't do anything about it. Or I'm not happy with my fitness level or my weight or whatever else, but I can't do anything about it.
Right.
Instead of sort of the, how do I do it sort of mindset around like, okay, I don't like this job. How do I find a better one? Okay, I'm not happy with my fitness level. What are my behaviors? What am I doing? How can I change them to get to where I want to be?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's kind of what I wanted to establish, because I think like some people like live in this victim mentality of, I'm at the effect of the environment of the universe. It's like, well, I can't do anything about my job. It sucks. And this is how my life is going to go for the rest of my life. I'm going to be miserable. And I'm like, I mean, yeah, well, then you're stopped, and then you don't even look at what could be possible and explore like the other options of how you can get out of that situation. Yeah, I'm saying maybe you don't quit your job today and just walk out and like figure it out then, but start creating an action plan to get you out of that unhappy situation if possible. And yeah, maybe it requires consulting other people, whether it's a therapist or maybe it's just like people who've done it before or friends, get some outside perspective, because you got to realize that your perspective is just one limited perspective. There's like a million there. And if you combine a bunch of brains, maybe together you can brainstorm a strategy to get out of that uncomfortable, unhappy situation. Yeah.
Yeah. When I find myself caught in that trap, one of the ideas that has given me a lot of mileage is thinking about, am I the only person who has ever been in this situation? And if not,
yeah,
which it never is true that I'm the only person who's ever been in that situation.
Right. Yeah.
If not, what actions did someone else take to get out of the position? Like, how did someone else figure this out? Because it is very easy to get caught in that trap of like, this really sucks. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this or make it better or change things. But if it's true that your position is not unique, and that is almost always the case, I might even say always, then there is some set of actions or some advice or some path that someone else has walked that can really help you see what it is that you need to do. And the other thing that's really nice about, there are other tactics that you can use, but figuring out what control you have and what actions you can take is it helps to take something external that's making you unhappy, potentially that you're internalizing and make you unhappy, and you get some control over it, which dissolves some of the internal unhappiness, right? Once you feel a little bit more in control and that you have some ability to change things, the impact of that external thing goes down. So it's kind of a strategy that works on both accounts.
No, I totally agree with that. I feel like when you feel like you actually have power over the situation, even if it's like minute, it versus like the like I'm helpless or there's nothing I can do about this, the hopelessness, that really, makes a difference in like how you go about your life and continue to move in the direction that you want to go, versus just staying resigned and hopeless about the situation and not really taking any actions. So I think that's really an important point that you made. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other examples of internal versus external situations from maybe...
Another one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
One that comes to mind for me that has a little bit of both is like it going up for a promotion, right? Or trying to make a sale or something that sort of has this, it's like a businessy interplay between you and someone else, and you're trying to get something. There again, I'll go with the promotion example just because I'm the most familiar with that.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to go up to get a promotion, Like there are both sorts of factors at play, right? And there's going to be some sort of external amount of influence around what is the final decision, right? And there's going to be a bunch of internal pieces around, okay, what are the choices I made leading up to this? What have I demonstrated to this employer? How have I sort of like won over the people around me and whatnot? As well as, if it doesn't go the way that I'm hoping, how am I going to like manage that sort of event internally? And then how am I going to like act around other people and whatnot? Because I've seen people go up for promotions and not get it and really dive deep, like headfirst into this idea of like, oh, the world's against me, everything sucks, without taking a more objective look at like, okay, well, what are the decision makers looking at? What evidence did they have to go on? Were you able to present everything? Is your position realistic? That's one of the huge ones I've seen, is a lot of people being in a job for 6 months, performing, average or worse, and going, why didn't I get a promotion? And it's really hard to actually take a serious look at, some of these things from an objective position. But I think that's another one. And you can tell me if you agree or disagree, that sort of has both sides of the equation at play.
Yeah, no, I would agree that it does. And that's a good thing. It kind of reminded me of like, just for my own work situation, since I work for myself as a business owner, kind of like the same type of principle or idea applied to my line of work, in that like, being a business owner, I am having to sell things. Like I sell my wellness program to people. And so I have people that are interested in it. And it's like, I know from like the sales training experience that I have, that I can't be attached to the outcome, like regardless of how it goes. Cause it's like the moment you're attached, then you F up the sale. It's like you're coming off too pushy or whatever. And it's like, it's on them to like decide if this is the right thing for them. And it's at the same time, it's like, well, I know if I get them to join the program, then I would be happier. But I also know that I can't be unhappy if they don't join. Like I can be happy in that I did the best that I can. And regardless of the outcome, it's the outcome. And so I try to like focus but it's hard to separate that, as I find I try to just focus on like, I just want to be as authentic as I can and really get connected with them and really help them see how this can make a difference and help them, make an empowered decision to do it or not to do it. It's like their choice ultimately, is kind of like helping me reframe it in a way of like, okay, regardless of the outcome, it doesn't matter. I'll still be happy, but I have to admit, like, I think I'd be a little happier if I made the sale, kind of thing. So it's kind of hard. It's like, yeah, it's like that internal struggle in a way.
Yeah, it's definitely easier said than done.
Yeah.
It kind of brought up for me a concept that has got a lot of mileage for me around focusing on sort of the process and what you're doing as much as you can, more than the outcomes, to try to get your value out that way. Right. Instead of, and I think actually the best example for me, at least, is playing poker. Because, when I was first playing poker, and I haven't played a ton of poker, but when I was first playing, I didn't really have a strategy. I didn't really know what was going on. Sometimes I'd win and I'd be like, yes, this is awesome. And sometimes I'd lose and I'd be like, oh no, like I got so unlucky and this sucks. And, there's obviously a large element of luck in that game. And when I switched my mindset, and this could be applied to way more stuff than poker, poker is just, for me, a very clear example. But when I switched my mindset away from, hey, am I winning or losing these hands, to, based on the information I had, did I make a good choice? And you can apply this, if you're doing sales, like based on the sort of skills or training I have, was I having the conversation with that person in a way that was authentic, or that hit, whatever skills I'm trying to work on, or back to the promotion piece, like, am I doing the kinds of work that is building the skills that I want and the reputation that I want, and sort of looking at all of this from more of a process oriented frame, instead of looking at the exact outcome. And like you said, it's really hard to divorce yourself completely from the feelings associated with the outcome. But the more you can hone in on the process, the easier it is to not be so attached to the outcome. By the time that I, had been playing poker for a couple months, I no longer cared at all about the outcome of the game. And I was so focused on like, okay, here's what I did. Was that actually a good choice? And going back and sort of figuring out like, oh, actually, in this hand, I played it this way. Yeah, I won, but actually it wasn't a good choice. Like based on what I knew, like that was just luck.
Yeah.
And there are going to be events like that in life that map similarly like, oh, wow, I really wasn't performing well and I still got promoted, but okay. So that's something that has done a lot of work for me, is just kind of trying to, as much as possible, hone in on the process and honing skills and my decision-making process and that sort of thing, instead of being really attached to these outcomes for events that have quite a bit of uncertainty, right? It's not 100%, like we talked about before. We still have a lot of ownership and control to a degree of what we do, but there is definitely an external factor as to whether like, is this person willing to buy this product? Like, is it actually something they want and going to help them? And in certain situations, no matter how well you sell, it's not going to work because they don't want it.
Yeah. Or, maybe they don't, like, they have their own situation and it's not a personal thing, that they don't want it. But yeah, I think that's a really good point that you made, in that we really, I like that you focus on like the processes versus like the actual outcome of, because I think when you get attached, or if you let the outcome determine your happiness, the wins or losses, it's just like, that's something you can do the best you can and you can still not get the outcome that you want. So if you focus on like doing the best that you can, like, did you make a good choice in that poker play? That's something you actually have a little more control over, versus like the outcome ultimately is partly up to chance to some degree, not 100%, but like to some degree it's up to chance. So it's like, if you focus on that, you're really kind of letting that dictate like how you show up in the next hand. If you're like, oh, well, this hand sucks, so the next hand I'm like, you're kind of like feeling defeated and you lost some money, you're like, why do I want to play? Then you don't really enjoy the process anymore, versus like going into like, oh, I want to learn and I want to get better and I want to just make good choices regardless of whatever happens, versus applying that to sales of, if I was just so focused on like all the sales that I don't make, then I would probably not be in the industry that I work in. It's like, I wouldn't be a business owner. And if I just focus on, I want to just have a real good conversation and to really get connected and authentic with people. So even if they don't buy, it's like, it's still a win in my mind, because I was focused on like the process and how I was in the conversation versus like whether they bought or not. So, and that gives me the ability to continue going versus feeling defeated and just like, I don't want to do this anymore, kind of a thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. When you're able to focus on the process and sort of find the pieces that you can work on, or what could have been different that you actually had control over, not what could have been different from an external perspective, that frees you from sort of getting trapped in these negative mindsets of, well, I didn't get promoted again, it's never going to happen, I hate this job.
Why bother?
And allows you to look at, okay, since I went up for promotion, or, until the next time I go up, what can I change? What's missing? And in some of these situations, you have the ability to ask people and sort of gather more information and get yourself more pointed in the right direction. And another piece of it is, as you sort of develop more of these opportunities, the outcomes are likely to, or at least more likely to go in your favor. Whereas, on the default path where you're just getting frustrated and not really looking at the process and just kind of like, well, I really wish that I got promoted, but I didn't, I guess I'll just try again, and not changing anything, you're likely to get sort of the same outcome. So there is a number of benefits from trying to just hone in on the process and work from that perspective instead of from the outcomes.
Yeah. And it increases your odds if you're continuing to go. Like if you were applying for a job, there's so many variables with that. And I could understand, if I apply to 100 jobs and I don't get anything, I would feel pretty defeated. But at the same time, it's like, you could be defeated and just stop applying and think like, what's the difference? It's not going to make a difference. Nothing's ever going to happen. But then if you stop applying, then you're definitely not going to get a job. You're not going to do it. Nothing's going to be different. versus like honing in your resume, maybe working with a career coach. Maybe it's like building up some skills so your resume looks better, like whatever, taking those actions and like continuing to apply, even though it sucks getting rejected all the time. But that is going to increase your likelihood of getting a job in the future versus just giving up and doing nothing. Essentially, it's not fun, but if you can just like focus on like, what can I build, or what can I do differently, or how can I get better, that gives you at least some hope to like continue on and persevere through it all.
And events like that are awesome because in the sense that they happen very frequently. So you can do so, or they can, right? You can send out 100 applications in a week. It's going to be a really busy week, but you can send it out in a week and see sort of what the results are.
Right.
And then depending on what they are, adjust your strategies, right? If you send out 100 and you hear back 0, then, it's a pretty clear signal that you need to change your strategy in some way.
Right.
And the opposite, if you send out 100 and you hear back 80, which would be ridiculous, then it's clear feedback that things in the process are working. So not everything can you get that much feedback or have that many opportunities to sort of go to bat, but a lot of things you can. There are a lot of things that you can quickly sort of try stuff out, see what the results are, try something else out, see what the results are, and hone the process that way.
Yeah, totally. Great. I think we covered this topic pretty well. Do you have any final thoughts, Donovan?
Yeah, there's one other angle I wanted to bring up, and I don't know how much talk we'll get out of it, but there's this idea floating around in my head around like, okay, one of the things that you can do to increase your happiness from an internal perspective is to become more sort of less reactive, right? Become more able to manage your emotions, become more able to manage some of the ways that you interact with people and things. And I'd be curious what your thoughts are around comparing that half against sort of, well, what if you get too good at that, right? And then there are things in your external environment that are like sort of bad, but not that bad. And you're just kind of like, well, that's okay, whatever. I can just manage it or make it work. To me, there's like this tension that has sort of been like rattling around in the back of my head that I wanted to sort of talk about and unpack a little bit.
I could see that. Well, I think there's like, an important distinction I'd want to make out of that is like, there's a difference between like, not letting it get to you versus like, I don't care. I think there's a difference between like, I don't care. F it. Like they want to be an a-hole, then I will, whatever. That's the difference versus, they're yelling and screaming and it doesn't bother me because, ultimately that's about them and not me. And so I think that requires a little bit more maturity versus like feeling resigned about it, if that makes any sense. So I want to make that distinction and difference clear. And so I think if you can get to a point where if someone's like yelling and screaming at you and you can actually be like, hey, it doesn't have anything to do with me, which is hard when if they're like screaming. It's just like internally your stress response gets activated and it's hard to, kind of calm yourself down and regulate and self-soothe and regulate. But I think it's possible, but it's just like, it's a hard skill to develop and it's a hard skill to practice because it's like our bodies are designed to get into that alert state. And in that state, like reactivity, technically, if you're just kind of being like avoidant, or just like giving up or defeated, I think that's still a reaction. It's not like an angry outburst, but like avoiding, just giving up is still a reaction in a way to the external environment versus not actually taking it in internally, being like, hey, that's about them. That's not about me. I'm still a good person. I'm still enough. I didn't do anything wrong. It's like, that's about them, which literally is like a hard skill that I've had to develop. And sometimes I get, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I react like a human being. I think it's a matter of just to some degree, I think we'll all react depending on how severe the external like stressor is. But with enough training and practice, I think you can kind of get out of that reaction faster. And I do feel like, being cold or like just stoic is technically a reaction to whatever's happening over there. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's opens up the topic in a really nice way. And I think that's a really nice distinction. That's the piece that I couldn't quite figure out before,
Yeah.
which is sort of there are reactions to events that externally might look the same, but internally are very different. And it's sort of the difference between sort of something happening externally and shutting down and avoiding it completely or blocking it out or whatever else. And that is one way of coping, but it's not nearly as useful as sort of this other way of coping of being able to take in external events and sort of hold them and shape them into something else, right? Which is to say, like, let's say someone's screaming in your face. One potential way to handle that is to just shut down and ignore it and not do anything.
Right.
There's probably another method that's similar, or it would seem similar externally, but that's around, like you were saying, okay, this person is really upset. It's not about me. I'm not going to take this personally or whatever. I am going to sort of leave space around, and, it depends on who it is, but we'll say it's someone you actually know and want to keep a relationship with. I'm going to leave space around, like, hey, I'm willing to talk about this, but I'm going to come back later, or sort of some of these other strategies that you're not engaging with it and you're not letting it sort of hit you with its full force, but you are still sort of looking at sort of some of the pieces that underlie that behavior and going like, okay, here's, like, in the future, we're going to do some work around it, as opposed to just like, I'm just going to ignore this right now. And it still might, in the moment, it might be 100% the same thing. They might be so mad that you can't say, like, we'll talk about it later.
Right,
you just have to leave. And it's the exact same reaction from an external standpoint, but internally you either like, okay, I'm never talking to them again, like, I'm done, or like, cool, I know that this person is heated, I will bring it back up at a time that's more appropriate. So no, I think that distinction, or that differentiation between ways of reacting really hits exactly what I was trying to tease out.
Yeah. But even if you can't have a conversation that's productive because, they're screaming and yelling or very reactive, you can still, like, in the best way that you can, which might be hard if they're yelling and screaming, is just be like, in the calmest, neutralist tone, to be like, hey, I get that you're upset right now. I'm not ignoring that. I want to have a conversation with you, but I think it's better if we're, like, able to talk more productively when things have calmed down. And so we'll revisit this conversation. So I'm not ignoring this conversation. It's a conversation that will need to be had. But clearly, I think emotions are running high right now. And I think we need to take a step back and breathe a little, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And as you were talking about that, it made me think it's not necessarily about accepting it. And I mean, I guess there are certain pieces, like, there are some external things that we sort of have to accept to a degree, but it's more about managing sort of the events appropriately, or like finding ways to interact with them that are useful. I think I'll use that word. I think that's a word that fits. Because if you get something like a cancer diagnosis just out of the blue, part of that is going to be accepting it, but part of it is going to be sort of managing it or finding a useful way to react to that information and the options that are available to you.
Yeah. And it'd be understandable if you get a cancer diagnosis that you can be upset about it, and it's okay to react, and you're human. And I think every human has their own way of, like, maybe they shut down, maybe they scream and yell, maybe they're just, like, in shock and just, like, don't even absorb. I hear a lot of times people who get those diagnoses have to be told a few times, because it's like the first shock is just like their brain just is like, what? And they need to be, like, retold, which is understandable. So, but yeah, it's all good points that we discussed. So I think we thoroughly covered this topic pretty well now. Any final thoughts?
No, I don't have any other secret topics.
That was a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's important for us and our audience to consider. All right, well, that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, and then go and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you get notified when the next video comes out. And if you check out in the description below, go to my website where you can get my free fast and easy guide to stress relief. Thanks again for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.